Do you remember the worst fight you've ever had with your mother? I was 16 in high school, beginning to test the boundaries of my newfound independence. My friends were all starting to get driver's licenses, and I was confident using public transport, which meant I was no longer reliant on my parents to get around for my daily activities. And thus, for the first time, my parents didn't always know where I was and couldn't directly control when I would arrive home, which you can imagine led to our first fight. You see, I had this bad habit of not being a good communicator about where I was or when I would be home. Part of this was just teenage attitude, like, you don't need to know where I am. Part of it was kind of ADHD time blindness, like not exactly thinking through the whole situation. And part of it was that really in development frontal lobe. So the afternoon in question, I arrived home later than expected. Now, this wasn't like into the wee hours of the morning. No, this was like definitely an hour after I was expected to be home. And of course, I had not communicated whatsoever about the change. I think I even looked at my cell phone and saw that I had many missed calls. Not good. Looking back, it was entirely my fault. But my indignant teenage self would never admit it. Thinking back, I can't even remember where I was. But what I do remember is the look on my mother's face when I arrived home. She was mad. Really mad. The type of anger that is a mask for fear. I walked in my mind, it wasn't a big deal. So what if I didn't tell her when I'd be home? I was safe. I generally made good decisions. And here I was home, but like an hour late. What's an hour? And although my memory is hazy, I'm sure if I would have apologized and owned up to my mistake, the voices wouldn't have escalated. But I didn't. And so they did. We were in the kitchen. The island is in between us, the only thing separating us as our voices rise and words begin to fly, arms out in emphatic gesture, our energy feeding off of each other in the way that only happens when you're fighting with someone you love and have a history with. But there was a different quality to this fight. There was an intensity to it that I had never experienced. You know those fights where both of you want to stop it, but you just can't? You're locked in. It was like we're driving on a highway and we saw the exit. And we started to turn the steering wheel to get into the off-ramp, but instead of turning, the car sped up instead. And exit after exit began whizzing by, and the car is just getting faster and faster. There was a moment when I realized that I didn't have control anymore. That there was a force exerting itself in that moment, that I was just a pawn. And inside I was screaming to myself, "Stop it!" And at the same time, my mouth began to form utterly painful words. Inside I'm shouting in horror, "Don't say that! Don't say it!" And of course, I did. I launched those words out of my mouth, wishing I could grab them and pull them back. But I couldn't. I think we've all been there, to some extent. Maybe yours was with a family member, or maybe someone that you worked closely with, a dear friend, or maybe even a teammate. When something seemingly small became a flashpoint. Maybe it was a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, a difference of opinion about something seemingly innocuous that instantly boils over with an intensity that seems out of proportion with the situation at hand. And you're kind of left in shock, defensive, confused, triggered. Like, how did we get here? If something is hysterical, then it is usually historical. Dr. Noel Larson reminds us. If something is hysterical, then it is usually historical. translated to mean when someone's, including yours, when someone's reaction to a situation has way more or way less energy than you would normally expect. You've entered the realm of trauma. Now, back to the fight. We're locked in. It looked like nothing was going to save us. And it wasn't until my mother's rage transformed into a deep, pained sadness that something shifted. I had grown up knowing that both my mother's parents had died in a car crash when she was 16. What I didn't know until that day, standing there in the kitchen when her rage broke into heartbreaking pain, was that she had been waiting for them at home and they had never arrived. That she had been waiting at home, like she had been waiting for me, and that they had never arrived. So there I was, the same age she was at the time of the crash, acting like a normal teenager, coming home late, not communicating properly, fumbling over my independence, and I had stepped on a deep wound, a trauma, a trigger that I never connected the dots about, and of course, shouldn't be expected to. Now that revelation changed everything. Clarity dawned within me, and I wish I could say that it resulted in me apologizing then and there, but I don't think I did. I think I just deflated and slumped down, retreating into my downstairs basement bedroom. Now, I need to say that my mom and I have a good relationship. It was a bit testy during my teenage years and my early adulthood, but now it's very strong and it's always been very loving. Despite her childhood trauma, I never felt its overt presence like I did on that day. It was never a secret or something we couldn't talk about. It was a few years later, though, that I started to connect some other dots together. My own anxiety when someone didn't show up on time was usually accompanied by intrusive images of them in a car crash. Or how when I was a passenger in a car, if there was a sudden acceleration or a close call or something unexpected, for the rest of the car ride, my knuckles would be white from gripping onto something. Or even the fact that I resisted learning to drive, not learning till I was 25 and about to move to Fort Collins, Colorado to take a job at Foothills Unitarian Church. Now, I never experienced a car-related trauma, nor did I notice my mother being a nervous driver. And yet, here I was, noticing anxieties, fear, intrusive thoughts and images related to an event that occurred decades before my birth. These are good clues that trauma is present. That what is going on didn't start with me. But like most people, we often don't look backwards for answers, we look around us, finding the blame for our experiences in ourselves or other people. And yet often we are better served to look backwards, to what lays unresolved in the past for clues. The stories that our families don't talk about, the histories that are ignored or whitewashed, the wounds that are too painful to speak about and thus weren't, the injuries too shameful to acknowledge. In his book, It Didn't Start With You, Mark Wolin writes, sometimes pain submerges until it can find a pathway for expression or resolution. That expression is often found in the generations that follow. That the legacy of trauma extends far beyond the lifetimes of those who experienced it directly. Resmaa Menakem writes that trauma is anything that happens too soon, too much, too fast, or too long. It is the body's protective response to the real or perceived inescapable overwhelm of a situation. That trauma is not about the event itself, but about the impact that event had on a person. It is what happens inside of us when what happened happens. And as pioneering Dutch psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk brought into modern awareness, it's the body, not the mind, where trauma resides. The body keeps the score. In fact, one of the first impacts of trauma is the impairment of the frontal lobe, causing an individual experiencing or reliving a traumatic event to have trouble thinking or speaking. They are no longer capable of communicating to either themselves or to others precisely what's going on. Thus, the realities of trauma can't be easily communicated through words, and they are often communicated by actions or inactions transmitted body to body. The way I probably noticed tension in my mother's body that she may not even have noticed in herself related to cars or lateness. Researchers have even found that trauma is passed down genetically. In fact, it could have been in my very DNA that I was predisposed to this sort of anxiety. In one scientific study, scientists conditioned mice to fear a certain smell. It happened to be an orange cherry blossom. They did this by electroshocking them each time the smell was released. Now, after a while, the shocked mice, they actually had greater amounts of smell receptors associated with that particular scent, enabling them to detect it at lower concentrations. But even more interesting, both their children, their pups, and their grandpups, when exposed to that blossom odor, became jumpy and avoidant, despite having never experienced it or the electroshots. The mice appeared to inherit not only the sensitivity to the scent, but also the fear associated with that scent. What's hysterical is historical. And as Resmaa Menakem adds, you're not defective, you're protective. I mean, it makes sense, right? The mice's reactions are not defective, they're passing down a pretty common sense instruction. Hey, watch out for this thing that smells like a cherry blossom because a shock's coming your way. The problem, of course, is that unlike a fear of snakes or plants that might, kill them, cherry blossoms aren't any threats to mice. So their big protective reactions are unnecessary and contribute to a heightened state of anxiety, especially during cherry blossom season. This intergenerational transmission of trauma is supposed to serve an evolutionary protective function. But imagine, if you will, with me, if those mice in those experiments were actually a group of humans, and that after a few generations they were released out of the lab. I know it's odd, but stay with me. Now, their trauma related to a smell would show up not just in their individual behavior, but in their very culture. They would not plant cherry trees. They would probably have a taboo against eating oranges. They would probably not choose to live in places where cherry trees were native or would systematically cut them down. After a few generations without any contact with cherry trees, the immediacy of the taboo might fade, but the injury probably remained. Rumors would develop that any tree that flowered like a cherry tree was also dangerous and should be removed. Maybe even a small splinter group would form to protect those other trees and would be shamed and exiled. As Resmaa Menakem writes, after months or years, unhealed trauma can appear to become part of someone's personality. Over even longer periods of time, it is passed on and gets compounded through other bodies in a household. It can become a family norm. And if it gets transmitted and compounded through multiple families and generations, it can start to look like culture. Now, of course, that's an imaginary situation, and yet replace the smell of cherry with, well, an experience with an ethnic group, nationality, or another religious group. Instead of fear of cherries, you have fear of the other. And while you uncover the roots of many modern conflicts and, well, racism, the way that the trauma of European bodies who were at war with each other for generations, causing a massive traumatic wound that only seemed to stop when they reconstituted themselves in a whiteness that turned the violence against Black and Indigenous bodies. That the root of racism is trauma itself. But of course, the problem with trauma is that it's passed down not in a neat package with an instruction manual to decode. Instead, we're sort of haunted by seemingly invisible ghosts, possessed by forces that exert a remarkable power over us, ghosts living not just in our conscious minds, but in our very bodies. So how do we, as Norman Doidge writes, turn ghosts into ancestors? We must heal backwards. Now, if you've ever had an experience working with children who experienced early childhood trauma, you know that often when they begin to feel safe in a new environment, their behavior tends to regress. They begin to act in ways younger than they are. Often this is because they are unconsciously returning to an age where they experienced trauma that stopped their normal development and are seeking to re-experience normal developmental experiences backwards. A teenager desiring to eat with their hands and throw food on the ground like a toddler, or maybe an elementary school-aged child asking to be held and rocked like an infant wanting a bottle or a pacifier. And what child development experts recommend when such behavior arises is to not fight it, to make them act their age, but to embrace it. Allowing the child to experience having their developmental needs being met, maybe for the first time, in a safer and a more connected relationship. Often once this has been done, it really of course just takes one moment, the regressive behavior will cease, turning that ghost into just an ancestor, that haunting into just history. To turn our ghosts into ancestors, we must heal the wounds of the past. Now, theologian Serene Jones says, with individual and collective trauma, the harm haunts you, haunts the dreams of the individuals and the collective unconscious of a society until you tell the story, till you face the truth of what happened. And Elaine, a few weeks ago, spoke about how shame gets in the way of us telling our stories, and how the way to move forward with that is to tell the story. But the problem with trauma is, of course, traumas that are passed down from generations to generations, or even our own, is that we often don't know the story we need to face or can't express it. And so we're left only with the residual behavior, that scar that formed around the wound of the trauma of the past, which becomes the nexus of our exploration for our most important tool, which is curiosity. For what we need to do is to discover the names of our ghosts, visible to us only in the murky manifestations of the present. But with enough curiosity, those manifestations start to congeal into something of a story that makes sense. Now, Monk Wolin in the book speaks about his work as a therapist with a man named Jesse. Jesse was a 20-year-old star athlete and straight-A student. But a year before he stepped into Mark's office, he had been hit with this persistent insomnia, causing him to spiral downwards into depression and despair. It was so bad that he had to drop out of college, forfeiting a baseball scholarship. Before this time, sleep had always come easy for him, but one night, just around his 19th birthday, he awoke suddenly at 3:30 in the morning. He felt cold, freezing. He was shivering, unable to get warm no matter what he tried. 3 hours and several blankets later, he was still wide awake. He was gripped with a new fear that if he fell asleep, something awful was going to happen. That if he went to sleep, he would die. Now, during the course of the therapy, Mark asked if either side of the family had suffered a trauma involving being cold or being asleep or being 19. This is the curiosity, right? Being curious about the behaviors that are being manifest. And Jesse revealed that his mother had only recently told him about the tragic death of his father's older brother, an uncle he never knew he had. Uncle Colin was only 19 when he froze to death checking power lines in a storm just north of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories in Canada. I get shivers reading that. Because 3 decades later, Jesse was unconsciously reliving aspects of Colin's death, the terror of letting go into the unconscious. For Colin, letting go meant death. For Jesse, falling asleep felt like the same. It was through making the connection that Jesse found a turning point. Grasping that his insomnia had its origins in an event that occurred 30 years earlier, he finally had an explanation for his fear of falling asleep. And the healing work of disentangling himself from the trauma endured by an uncle he'd never met or never knew about could begin. Maybe what you are struggling with didn't start with you. Maybe what we are struggling with as a society didn't start with us. Maybe what we are called to be is curious about our experiences and begin to see the patterns so that we can heal backwards. Now, when I was in college, I started to go to therapy after I had my first panic attack, a crippling experience of deep existential fear and dread. I remember one session, my therapist looked at me and said, "You know that's not normal, right?" I sort of blinked at her. What? I had been recounting that ever since I was a child, I had an ever-evolving but always up-to-date plan of what I would do when both my parents were killed. Which relative would my sister and I stay with? Would I drop out of school to get a job? Would I move back home from college? All of it worked out, preparing for what just seemed like the inevitable. You've had this for how long? Ever since I remember? Most children don't have that plan, she told me. In fact, it would never cross their minds to need one. Why do you think it did for you? I sat there stunned because I knew the answer. And I had found the place for the healing to begin. It didn't start with you. What's hysterical is historical. You're not defective, simply protective. It's time to heal backwards. Amen, and blessed be.